Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our Wisconsin's Green Fire Conservation Webinar, Living Ancestors, the History and the Ecology of Old Growth Forests in Wisconsin, with our guest panelist today, John Bates. My name is Fred Clark, and I'm the Executive Director of Wisconsin's Green Fire, and I'm joined today by our Assistant Director, Nancy Larson, one of our founding members, Bob Martini, and our guest panelist, John Bates. For those of you who are Wisconsin Green Fire members, we welcome you, and we're glad to provide this opportunity to take a virtual field trip in some of our most special places in Wisconsin. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, we welcome you as well, and we appreciate very much your interest, and we hope you find this program valuable. Wisconsin's Green Fire supports the conservation legacy of Wisconsin by promoting science-based management of natural resources. We're entering our 4th year of service in 2020, and we're one of Wisconsin's strongest voices for science and conservation and environmental protection. Our members work throughout Wisconsin on issues including wildlife, fisheries, water resources, forests, farms and working lands, the science of climate change, and our path to renewable energy. We encourage you to learn more about Wisconsin's Green Fire on our website, www.wigreenfire.org. So just a couple of technical points. If it's your first time on a Zoom webinar, most of you will be seeing a screen that looks something like this. And if you look up to the upper right corner of your screen in the large black frame, you'll see a set of controls that will say something like view options. And if you want to change your viewing options, you should be able to toggle between a gallery view or a speaker view. And typically, you'll be able to adjust the size of the full frame that you see when John begins his slideshow. So take a look at that. Also, at the lower bar of your screen, you'll see some different controls. And a couple of those we encourage you to use. If you are having any technical difficulties or having trouble hearing, or if you think we're having any technical difficulties, send us a chat. And you can send a chat that Nancy and I and our panelists will see, and we can try to address those if we can. We're going to encourage folks to generate questions for John, and at the end of his presentation, we'll have some time to address those. And don't make them all softballs. John has been in the woods for 30 years or more, and he's got a wealth of knowledge. We'll only be able to scratch the surface today and some of that, but we really encourage you to think of questions that would be really of interest for all of us. So if you want to do that, select the Q&A button down at the lower control bar. That'll allow you to generate a question and send it up to us. And Nancy will filter those and moderate those with John when we get into that portion of the program. Finally, we're recording the program, and you'll be able to see or share a recording of that program after we've completed that and have it posted in the next day or two. We'll also be sending you a survey to gauge your interest and your reaction to the program that you should receive tomorrow. Nancy, any other comments on our webinar platform?
Fred, I think you've covered it. Just encourage people again to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to type in questions. Again, we can't hear or see you, but we'll read your questions and forward them on to John, and we'll have a good virtual discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. So before we start our program today, we wanted to take a few minutes and recognize the passing of one of our founding members, Dan Wisniewski. Dan was a champion for so many important achievements in conservation in Wisconsin, including his longtime deep involvement in protecting forests and old growth forests throughout Wisconsin. And John will be talking about the results of some of that work today, but Right now, we wanted to ask Bob Martini, who is a longtime friend of Dan's and one of Green Fire's founding members, to share a few words about Dan. Bob?
On April 16th, we lost one of Wisconsin's conservation leaders and a founding member of Green Fire, and Dan Wisniewski. If you read his obituary, you wonder how he could have fit all those jobs into a life cut short. And has had as many conservation accomplishments in retirement as he had in his professional life. In a recent email, Ron Eckstein mentioned Dan's trout lunacy, surely with the most expansive and complementary meanings of the term, including passion, hard work, innovation, and cooperative effort. By that definition, Dan was also engaged in land conservation lunacy, good government lunacy, literature lunacy, old growth forest lunacy, and beer with friends lunacy. He believed in sustainability, whether it was in reference to forests or trout, land or government or friendships. I really like the fact that even though he was not a scientist, having been trained in journalism and English literature, he was a believer in the value of science. He regularly advised governors, senators, and anyone else he had influence over how to implement science-based natural resources management. He lived the mission of Wisconsin Green Fire for most of his life. But most of all, he was just a great guy to be around, sharing a beer or a trout stream or a break at a board meeting. Our sympathy goes out to the family for their loss, a loss we share in the conservation family. The Northwoods Land Trust, whom Dan served as a board member, has recently decided to name a 40-acre riverfront property we obtained from the Board of Commissioner of Public Lands, with Dan's help, renamed it the Dan Wisniewski Deerskin River Preserve in his honor. It's not a coincidence that Deerskin River is a fine trout stream.
Thank you, Bob. And among many other acts, Dan's legacy is going to be written on the work that we'll be hearing from today with John. So our guest today, John Bates, is the author of 9 books, and he's been a contributor to several others, all of which focus on the natural history of the Northwoods. John has worked as a naturalist in Wisconsin's Northwoods for 30 years. And he's led an array of trips and given talks, all designed to help people better understand the remarkable diversity, the beauty of nature, and our place within it. In his most recent book, Our Living Ancestors, the history and the ecology of old growth forests in Wisconsin and where to find them. John has served on the Board of Trustees for the Wisconsin chapter of the Nature Conservancy. He's served on the Wisconsin Humanities Council and the River Alliance of Wisconsin. And he's currently serving on the board of the Northwoods Land Trust, as did Dan Wisniewski, and is on the board for the Wisconsin Conservation Hall of Fame. John and his wife, the fiber artist Mary Burns, live on the Minnetowish River in Iron County, where they've raised 2 daughters. John, we're looking forward to your program, and thanks so much for joining us today.
My pleasure to be here. I'm honored to get a chance to talk to everybody. I'm hoping my screen is coming up. We'll see. Oops, here we go. Is that working, Fred?
Yes, and you are perfect.
Maybe the last moment that I'm perfect, so we'll see how it goes. Just some background on this book, on the old growth book. I began it in 2003, and it's important to note that I'm a naturalist, I'm a generalist, I'm a guy with a master's in environmental science, but I'm not a PhD forest ecologist or a professional forester. So I spent a lot of time talking to people way smarter than me and way more experienced than I am. And I think I acted more as a journalist in many ways in writing this book than I did as a naturalist. And I'm indebted to a number of folks that are members and or on the board of Green Fire, folks like David Mladenov and Eric Epstein and Randy Hoffman, Ron Eckstein, Linda Parker, John Krause. There's a bunch of names, people that have done a whole lot of work in this state on the research end and on the management end. And I'm totally indebted to them. So I profess no, I have no pretense anyway of being a professional forester or forest ecologist. But my job, I thought, was to read every last thing I could do on old growth forests in the upper Midwest and try to bring those scientific papers down to earth through my writing for the general public. And that's one thing that I do reasonably well, is try to translate and affect all that scientific jargon into something that folks, regular folks, can understand who just love to walk the woods. So that's how the book came to be. It took about 15 years to come into being. It was an old growth project in and of itself. It took so dang long to make it happen. So I like to start with just talking about a place as a space with a story. What I want to do in this talk is mostly speak about northern Wisconsin and work our way through what this looked like in pre-settlement times, why we cut down as much as we cut down, what we have left and where it is, and then maybe a vision of what we might do in the future. I'd like to I need to have a small caveat or apology potentially to folks that are very well tuned in already as professional foresters or ecologists. Some of this may seem quite general to them. Again, this is intended for a general audience, so I apologize if it's too easy as such. So there are three myths that I like to dispel right away. The first myth is that all of northern Wisconsin was old growth, and that a squirrel, in fact, all of eastern the United States was old growth, and a squirrel could get on a tree in New York City and never have to touch the ground all the way to Wisconsin. Hardly true at all. The best ecologists in our state and in the upper Midwest say that 2/3 to 3/4 of our forests were in a mature old growth composition prior to settlement, and the other 1/3 to 1/4 were in regrowth stages from various natural disturbances and cultural disturbances. Second myth is that this was an untouched virgin forest. I love this quote by William Cronin, and if you'll bear with me, I'm just going to read it because it's so well said. He says, "There's been no timeless wilderness in a state of perfect changelessness, no climax forest in permanent stasis. It's tempting to believe that when Europeans arrived in the New World, they confronted virgin land, the forest primeval, a wilderness which had existed for eons, uninfluenced by human hands. Nothing could be further from the truth. In Francis Jennings' telling phrase, the land was less virgin than it was widowed." And what Bill Cronin's talking about in part in that widowing statement is that by the time we Euro-Americans arrived here, much of the Native American population had been decimated by various diseases. 80 to 90% is the general consensus of how many had died. It was a tidal wave of disease that we inflicted both accidentally and purposely on Native Americans. However, I found it very interesting, just as a side note, Dr. Douglas Houghton, in traveling with Henry Schoolcraft in 1832, was up in the UP, and he vaccinated over 2,000 Native Americans against smallpox, which I found fascinating. He estimated that the Ojibwa had already experienced smallpox 5 times in the previous 60 years. And the illness, of course, had been with us since the mid-1500s as trade routes were being established. So the Ojibwa and other Native American tribes experienced cycles and cycles of disease coming through. So a virgin forest, also Native Americans would object to that statement rather strongly because they were here. It was not a virgin forest in that regard. The people have been here for 8,000 or more years. A book on northern Wisconsin talking about the Ojibwa by plants used by the Great Lakes Ojibwa, Jim Meeker, Joan Elias, talked about the Native Americans utilizing 384 species of plants, basically 1/3 of the total flora for all of those uses that you see on the screen. So they were altering the forest for 8,000 years. One thing that I found very interesting, locally, I live in the tiny little crossroads of Manitowish, population maybe 29 or some such number. And just to the south of us is the Frog Lake and Pine State Natural Area. And it's got some old growth white and red pines in it. And several of the red pines in the stand and white pines have major fire scars on them. And a fellow named Jed Minier, who I've yet to meet, I have to someday because I keep quoting him, took a slice out of one of those red pines, and you see that picture of that red pine with the fire scar. You might see that horizontal slice at the very base of it. Took a cookie out of the base of that tree and found that that tree had begun growing in 1805. So it's a 215-year-old red pine. But there were fire scars basically every decade from the 1830s to 1890s, and then other fires nearby areas in the early 1900s. The likelihood of there being natural disturbances every decade in this particular area is very small. It's speculation, certainly on my part, but it seems only logical that Native Americans were setting fires here on a consistent basis in the Northwoods. Not as much, certainly, as in the southern part of the state and the oak savannas and prairie country, but Native Americans were utilizing fire up here as well, so altering the forest, changing the composition as well. When we talked to Native American elders from Lac du Flambeau, they described the area south of the Lac du Flambeau village as being a prairie, and it had been kept in a prairie, they say, for centuries, because in large part they wanted to grow blueberries and strawberries and blackberries and all the berries one would want, which almost all grow in full sun. So Native Americans were using fire up here and altering the forest. So the notion of virgin, not touched by humankind, is simply wrong. And the third myth is that all of northern Wisconsin was a pinery. Not at all the case. Most of northern Wisconsin was a hemlock hardwoods or a hardwood hemlocks, however you wish to say it, with some super canopy white pines. A map of the early vegetation of Wisconsin shows in that darker green what is referred to as northern mesic forest, the major components being sugar maple, eastern hemlock, yellow birch, and American basswood, with some component, some super canopy component of white pine. The only places that we really had white and red pines as the climax true old growth species where our soils were particularly sandy, and that's Oneida and Vilas counties, and then in those far eastern and far western counties where the pines, because they're a species that tolerates drought very well, can tolerate sandy soils and can outcompete the hardwood hemlocks. So you can see from that map that really most of northern Wisconsin was not a pinery, but was in fact hardwood hemlocks with some super canopy white pine. David Mlodinow went through all the surveyor records meticulously and came up with this chart of the percentage of trees pre-settlement, hemlock being number 1, nearly 14% of the forest, sugar maple number 2, yellow birch number 3. Again, those are the major components of hemlock hardwoods. White pine represented about 9% of the Northwoods. Jack pines down there at about 4%, and red pines also about 4%. So around 17% of the Northwoods, at least via David's analysis, was quote, quote, in pine. But really the vast majority of uplands was in these hemlock hardwood forests. So out of our 36 million acres of land in Wisconsin, somewhere around 20 million acres were forested, and somewhere around 11 to 14 or so million acres were hemlock hardwoods, about 2/3. And really only about 2 million acres were dominated by pines, about 10%. So there's a map of the pre-settlement forests of the Great Lakes states, just to show you that things vary from Michigan to Wisconsin to Minnesota. Note all the yellow in Minnesota, which is aspen birch forest. Minnesota is much drier in its northern forest than we are. And so it was more of a fire-based system over there. And we, if you'll note on our map, show no yellow, no aspen birch, which is estimated somewhere 3 to 5% of the northern forest was in aspen birch. It was predominantly, again, this hemlock hardwood forest. Michigan, interestingly enough, shows the most pine. Notice the dark green over there. They had the good sandy soils, quote, quote, good sandy soils over there that supported the greatest pinery in the upper Midwest. So the question I wanted to answer in part in the book was, why did we cut it all down? You know, we all wonder, but why didn't someone have a vision to save some of it, for goodness sakes? We'll get to the statistics of how much we have left, but it's minuscule. Why didn't we save it? And it's a very simple answer, I think, because wood was the way, meaning that it was used for everything from building cradles to building coffins, so from cradle to grave, and everything in between. And wood was in the way. So you see this happy couple with their 4 children, and this is in Black River Falls, looking at their land behind them, at their homesteading, and they have to it's all been clear cut, and they need to plant. There's not a Red Owl grocery store down the road that they can eat from, get their food from. So wood was in the way, and some statistics later in the talk discussing how much was likely lost in fires and in purposeful cutting just to get it down so we could plant. So it was the way of the world. It was used for everything, all fuels, etc., but also was in the way. When you think about Wisconsin and population gain over time, it happened very rapidly. It was called the Great Swarming by historian Charles Clark. If you look at our population in 1840, a census was taken. Although I really don't know how they managed that, but let's say there were 30,000 people. We became a state in 1848, and bingo, by 1850 we have 305,000. By 1870 we have 1 million people. My heavens, and those 1 million people, they all need houses, they all need fences, they all need barns, they all need firewood, they all need wood for 100 other purposes. A veritable locust swarm of Euro-Americans coming out into Wisconsin and suddenly needing wood. And if you can imagine what that would have looked like and required, it tells you why wood was the way and wood was in the way. I love this picture of a log jam on one of our rivers just in 1 year. This log jam was 15 miles long and 30 feet high. Note the 3 people standing on the log jam on the left-hand side of the photo. 2 women in long dresses and a guy in his fine Sunday coat. I have no clue what they were doing out there. I wish I could ask. It must be an interesting story. You don't walk out in your Sunday finest and hang out on the log jam. At least I wouldn't think normal folks would. But anyway, there they are. It just gives you a sense of what was going down any given river in northern Wisconsin in any given year. Bob Martini, who spoke earlier, is a river ecologist, did phenomenal work for us throughout the state in altering our rivers from highly polluted to relatively pollution-free. And he talks about, and I talk about, the gouging of riverbanks by all of those logs coming down the river. There's but it's just the St. Croix. I can't quite remember which river this is. I apologize. But think about all those logs gouging those riverbanks, such that almost all of our rivers in northern Wisconsin have been widened and thus shallowed, and are still impacted morphologically by those log jams. So we're not only cutting down all that wood for barns and fences and so forth, but we were cutting down eastern hemlocks by the literal tens of millions to tan leather. Eastern hemlock has 10% tannic acid in its bark. And Milwaukee, if you're not aware, led the world in tanning of leather in the early 1900s. In 1907, the statistic I have is that Milwaukee tanned 2 million hides. The tanneries, they had up to 30 tanneries at one time in the late 1870s or so. Anyway, 2 million hides, and the statistic is it takes the bark from 1 hemlock tree to tan 1 hide. So if you think of 1907 alone, 2 million hides, somewhere around 2 million hemlock trees. Now, there were other trees being used, but hemlock was the main tree being used, particularly for heavy leather, for boots and so forth. So we were cutting down an enormous number of hemlocks. There's a chart to your left of the location of tanneries in our state. The dark shaded counties had more than 5. The lighter shaded had 1 to 5. I have no way to really quantify how many total tanneries there were in the state. Geez, probably 100 or more, all cutting down these trees. You see the picture in the bottom. The bark peelers, they were peeling the bark in June, fighting black flies and mosquitoes. It would be a hell of an awful job. Loading that bark then on trains when trains were were finally got up here, or taking them by sleigh to the local tanneries. And here's a picture of some of the workers in the Lohman Tannery in Two Rivers. And it was not a pleasant job, to say the least. There's really some fascinating history about hemlock tanneries. Here's the Rib Lake Tannery in 1916. So all this bark is coming to these tanneries and being stacked in these huge piles. And the bark is actually being used as the roofing material over it. Some of these bark piles, the literature says, were up to a half-mile long, which I find almost unbelievable, but that's what the literature says. And you think about where all the hides are coming from to support all this tanning. Well, there's this little city called Chicago, south of us, that was the slaughterhouse capital of the world. And so hides were very close by to be shipped into Milwaukee and Racine and Sheboygan and so forth, all along Lake Michigan. And hides were being brought in from all over the world. Again, this was a world-renowned tanning area. And our leather in Wisconsin was being sent all over the world. So we're cutting down all these hemlocks, we're cutting down all the pines, we're in the second phase cutting down all the hardwoods once the railroads get here. And what's left behind in any big clear cut is slash. And you have your one mule if you're a homesteader, or your one oxen, or whatever you may have, but you're looking at all this slash and you need to plant. So you need to get rid of that slash right now. So you take a match to it. And William Butler Ogden has this wonderful quote: "Fire is the pillar lighting the path of empire on its westward way." We used fire a lot. The axe was the right hand, the match was the left hand, in order to create fields like this. Think of pulling all those stumps with horses or dynamite, my Lord. Every time I drive by a field in northern Wisconsin, I think of all the work that it took to open that field. It's just astonishing. I would have died or gone back back east. Too much work for me. This was called by Stephen Pine, who wrote a really fascinating book, Fire in America. He called this the Holocaust fire era. His quote there is: "Fires of unprecedented size and intensity rampaged over small villages and towns and earned names as historic events. Half a dozen Holocausts achieved special notoriety because of damages to property and loss of life. Any one of them could qualify as perhaps the worst fire disaster in American experience." So I listed three. Everyone knows the 1871 fires for Peshtigo, but I don't know if you also knew that fires were burning simultaneously in Illinois, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, North Dakota, and Minnesota. It was a very dry summer and fall in 1871. The fires in 1871 covered 2 million acres in Michigan. You don't hear about that. Over 5% of the state of Michigan was burning at the same time we had the Peshtigo fires and the Chicago fire. 1894 fires, the Hinckley Fire in Minnesota, the Phillips Fire in Wisconsin. The Hinckley Fire, 126 people took refuge in the marsh and basically found their way into a crematorium. Phillips Fire destroyed 100,000 acres, all these homes in Phillips and Price County, and 13 people died trying to escape by swimming across the lake. And then 1918, the fire in Cloquet, Minnesota, most famous of all, 453 people died. The scene at the station was indescribable. There came a rush of wind and the entire town was in flames. The trains pulled out with the fires blazing closely behind them. The flames looked at the cars. Windows in the coaches were broken by the heat. Boy, if you read the history closely, there were fires almost every year from basically right around 1870 to 1920. We're starting to get control of fire by then. So it was a 50-year period of fires burning again and again and again, whatever is left. And what's interesting is that most people saw this as good. The Detroit Post, major newspaper in Michigan in 1881, after hundreds of thousands of acres had burned, had this to say, and I'm going to read it because it's so fascinating. They say, "After all these fires, it's a chance for new settlers. Where the fires have raged, the forests have been killed, the underbrush burned, the ground effectively cleared. There are square miles, whole townships where the earth is bare of everything except a light covering of ashes, and other square miles where all that's needed to complete the clearing is to gather up a few scattered chunks per acre and finish burning them. These lands are now in such a condition they're ready for seeding. The trees, the underbrush, and all the impediments to agriculture that usually cost so much in toil for the pioneer to remove have been swept away, and the rich land lies open and ready, cleared for the settler. There's other great advantages too. The insects and forest pests of the farmer are nearly all extinct. There'll be no potato bugs, no weevils or armyworms, very few birds or squirrels, thank God. For several years to come on these lands, there can be no more fires because there are no more brush or swamps to burn. What a Chamber of Commerce view of these Holocaust fires. And that's in large part how it was viewed at the time, because the plow was supposed to follow the axe. The estimates of the amount of timber that was lost to fire run as high as 20% of Michigan's original 380 million board feet. Philbert Roth estimated in 1898 in a report that he made that there'd be 26 billion feet he figured had been wasted, again, about 20% of the original stand. Robert Fries, who wrote a fabulous book, if you haven't read it, called Empire and Pine, he estimates that perhaps more good pine timber was burned than ever reached the sawmill. So he would say over half never made it because of all the fires. So the plow is supposed to follow the axe. The reality is to the right of what homesteaders found when they came here, and the vision is to the left. How to turn the reality into that vision was the trick. And the only way to do that European settlers knew was to cut it all down, burn it, and replant it into European grasses and crops. We had a hand in that, the University of Wisconsin, that is, in encouraging people to come here into northern Wisconsin. Dean William Henry wrote a really fascinating booklet called A Handbook for the Homeseeker, wrote in 1896, printed 50,000 copies, that's quite a few, in English, German, and Norwegian, and sent them over to Europe to encourage people to come over here and homestead northern Wisconsin, because the Bluegrass Land Company says a farm in Wisconsin will make money for you from the start. Crops never fail. The land, and this Bluegrass Land Company was in St. Germain, by the way, which is in Vilas County, which is pure sand. The land is rich, clay bottom, making it the most productive hayland in America, just as good as those famed bluegrass lands of Kentucky. I've often wondered, and I don't know how much of this was ignorance and how much of it was fraud. I don't know. The university sent up to the North Country here land trains called the Land Clearing Special, trying to demonstrate to folks how to pull stumps and how to clear the land so they can get started. Tremendous amount of effort, wonderful history to read, but to make it short, a massive failure. By 1927, 1/4 of all the land in Wisconsin's 17 northern counties were offered for sale as tax delinquent. People came, they tried, they failed, and they left. And in fact, there's a whole lot of fraud going on in the cutting as well, and that's a whole nother story. So there was townships and much larger areas than just townships that were cut under the belief, under the supposed attempt to homestead land, and there's no attempt really being made. It was cut and cut out, and that was the case. So why didn't it work up here? 3 factors. One is there's no markets. Here's a road going into Boulder Junction in the early 1900s, and you can see the market there at the end of the road. Well, you can't, there's nothing there. So you can imagine just trying to take your horse and wagon with all of your produce somewhere down that road. We had this other minor factor called winter in northern Wisconsin. So we have a very short growing season. The bottom slide shows a farmer's total produce in his first year in the Minocqua area. He raised 1 bushel of potatoes. That's all he was able to pull off. The third factor of why it failed is simply we have poor soils. Anyone who lives in southern Wisconsin knows what soil looks like. We in northern Wisconsin still aren't real clear about what that really looks like. I live in southern Iron County in a bunch of sand. If you live in Oneida and Vilas County, you're living in a bunch of sand. And the rest of northern Wisconsin, other than the far east and far west, which is also very sandy, is called sandy loams or silty sandy loams, or sandy, well, that's good enough. Sandy loams works. Still relatively poor soils. So combined lack of markets, poor soils, and winter said that what we're best at up here is growing trees, cranberries, blueberries, and that's about it. I love this chart produced in the 1920s, but it shows a map in the 1913 because everybody really wanted the Northwoods to become this Jeffersonian dream of farms, small farms. So the upper number, let's just look at Vilas County. It's the percent of improved land in each county as of 1913. So 0.4%. After all the cutting and all the attempt by 1913 anyway to get people up here less than 1% had been quote, quote, improved, thus made into farms. The estimate was by people with rose-colored glasses that 25 to 35% could be made into farms. And by 1925, only 1.4% had been made, despite all the best efforts we could bring forth to convert these forested lands into agriculture. You look across at all the other counties, most were better than Violet's, but still pretty poor percentages. Ashland 5% by 1925. So add on the Depression coming on the heels of that very shortly, and we learned quickly that finally gave in to the fact that what we do again best up here is grow trees, and that we needed to reconvert what we had hoped to be plowed land back into forest land. And we end up with 6 million acres of public lands in county, state, and federal forest. The response to all that cutting, all that fire, and after all of the farms had gone belly up was a whole lot of white birch and aspen, which are early successional species, do well in full sun. Lisa Schulte in a scientific paper says probably the largest human-caused forest type conversion in history, converting 17 million acres of forested land, of older growth forests, very little that was white birch and aspen, into white birch and aspen. And so this map shows the modern forests of the Great Lakes states today, and you'll see all that yellow that hadn't been either in Michigan or in Wisconsin, which now represents aspen birch. So we've regrown our forest, but we've certainly not restored our forest to anything close to what it once was. This again is that photo, the map of what once was pre-settlement. And the changes are threefold, in particular loss of conifers, loss of all the pines, loss of hemlocks, spruces and so forth, conversion of a lot of forested land to ag, and then H-class conversion, taking this 2/3 to 3/4 old growth forest and converting it to very young forest. So what's left in the lake states? Lee Frelich, who's the guru of old growth out of Minnesota, forest ecologist at the University of Minnesota, provides these statistics. 2.8% of near boreal forest, nearly all of it in the Boundary Waters Canoe area, is left. Northern hardwood hemlock, 72,000 acres, 0.2%. And I need to point out very quickly that half of that is in the Porcupine Mountains, 35,000 acres, 15,000 acres is in Sylvania in the UP. So 50,000 acres, and two stands alone comprise 3/4 of that 72,000 acres. White and red pine, only 57,000 acres, 0.6%, nearly all of which is in the Boundary Waters Canoe area. And we do have a lot of, not a lot, but some swamp conifer component left that's old, 2.2%. What's left in Wisconsin? I asked Randy Hoffman, who worked for the DNR for many, many years, and was instrumental in, along with others, in establishing many of our state natural areas. He sent me these statistics as of 2014, and you can argue about these statistics endlessly because how does one define old growth? But he's defining it as 150 years and older. So if we look at hemlock, we have currently 6,644 acres. Remember that 640 acres is 1 square mile, so that's 10 square miles, 3 miles by 3 miles basically. Northern hardwoods, 2,500 acres. White pine, only 1,000 acres, not maybe a mile by 1.5 miles total. White cedar, quite a bit more, mainly because white cedar swamps are hard to get into. You can note that there are some possibilities here in terms of older forest, 120 to 150. There's higher numbers there, and forests at 100 years and older, there's some decent sized numbers there that we can work from if we choose to manage for more old growth in our state. I added down at the bottom, nothing against golfers whatsoever. My father loved to golf. There are 505 golf courses, I found out about 2015. I was looking this up. Each average maybe around 175 acres. That's about 88,000 acres. So we have way more of our land and golf courses than we have an old growth forest, just showing you where our priorities are. One of the huge issues with old growth forests is how in the world do you define them? And people argue about this endlessly, and there is no way to ultimately define it because how old is old, how big is big, how much is enough? And how pristine is pristine? So we'll look at those 4 questions very quickly. If you have an aspen forest, heck, it's old growth by its time is 60 years old because it's a short-lived species. They're dying pretty dramatically by 80 years old. If you look at white and red pine, old growth begins at 130, more or less, and they can live to be 400 years old. So I like to compare this to human beings. We average living 80 years. If you took white pine at 130, that's about 1/4 of its possible longevity. It'd be like saying that we're getting old when we're 20, 22 years old. So our old growth definitions are based ecologically. They make sense. Old growth is beginning. We're having components more of down trees and a whole lot of coarse woody habitat available and other components by that time, and that's beginning, but it certainly doesn't represent truly old trees. So how old is old? It'll always be a difficult question to answer. Our oldest trees, by the way, are our eastern white cedars that grow along the Niagara Escarpment. There's a wonderful book that I have noted in the bottom there called The Last Stand. It's in Ontario, written by Peter Kelly and Doug Larson. And they climbed down all these cliff faces, the Niagara Escarpment cliff faces in Ontario and the Bruce Peninsula, and cored some of these tiny little white cedars coming out of the cliff faces, and found that the oldest living tree currently germinated in 688 AD. That's over this now, but 1,330 years old. It was less than 21 feet tall. They found a dead cedar at the base of Flower Pot Island, which is just off the tip of the Bruce Peninsula. That had lived, the rings showed 1,890 years. This was a revelation to me in writing this book, that the Niagara Escarpment supports the most extensive old growth forest east of the Rocky Mountains. Who knew? And of course, nobody's going to cut these babies down. You can't get to them for one, and what would you do with them anyway? These trees grow at an infinitely slow rate because gravity's going to take them down. So the last thing you want to do is grow. You're going to grow very slow. And they're just these wonderfully gnarly, twisted and contorted trees coming out of these cliff faces. My wife and I and daughter visited the Bruce Peninsula 2 falls ago and just had a wonderful time walking along trails above these cliffs and looking down on a lot of these cedars. How big is big? Well, eastern hemlocks can be really small and still be very old. So a hemlock less than 2 inches diameter breast height can be over 200 years old. Hemlocks waiting in the shade in a seedling state, knee-high, waist-high, they can be well over a century old, just waiting in the shade. Some Canadian authors said they could be ticketed for loitering. I like that. They just wait and wait and wait. Don't take suntan lotion into the eastern hemlock stands. It's all shade. You won't need it. Hemlocks less than 12 inches DBH have been aged at 359 years old. So size does not equal age. How much is enough? Here's a fabulous white pine in the yard of some folks up in Bayfield County, right near the town of Bayfield. We measured it as, 49-inch diameter. We went up to the folks, knocked on the door and said, what do you know about this tree? Well, they had a picture. It was planted in 1896. So it was only 100 and whatever, 10, 15 years old at the time we stopped at their place. So that's not an old, how many do you need per acre? Do you need 1 big old white pine? Do you need 10 big old white pines or 10 big old hemlocks? How many do you need per acre to say that's an old growth forest? And how many acres do you need to say it's a forest community? These are really hard definitions to come by. And how pristine is pristine? Well, nothing's pristine. Again, Native Americans have been here for 8,000 plus years. Plus there are these things called acid rain, climate change, introduced species, which infiltrate all these sites whether a human being is standing there or not. So the question is how much lack of, is there such a word as pristinity, is permissible? Is it okay for some grazing? Could there have been some logging? Could there have been some gathering in order for us to still call it an old growth forest? Here's the Lake Laura State Natural Area near Star Lake. That is an understory of almost all Pennsylvania sedge. And this is not anything human beings have done directly. Indirectly, it's because we have introduced earthworms and we have too high a population of deer. So you end up with this depauperate understory, almost nothing growing trees and saplings in the understory, almost nothing in an herbaceous species, but sedges. The Wisconsin DNR has issued a handbook on old growth and old forest in 2006. Difficult to find, but there's the number if you want to call the DNR and see if you can get a hold of it. It's really, there's a lot of fabulous information in it. A number of people who may be listening in on this broadcast helped to write it. And they differentiated 3 different categories of old growth in Wisconsin. One is called relic forest, appears to have never been manipulated, exploited, or severely disturbed. Basically pre-European settlement quality. Number 2 is an old growth forest, defined as relatively old and relatively undisturbed. These trees are biologically old. They're containing some trees which are nearing or beyond their average expected lifespan. And you can read the rest. And then the 3rd category is an old forest, defined as older than a typically managed forest, meaning not biologically old, but beyond the economic maturity age at which they are commonly cut. So they're not senescent. I don't like that word senescent, by the way. It needs to be taken out of the handbook, because trees, when they get old, are not necessarily senescent by any means. Swinomic National Forest defines old growth as a community with dominant trees at or near biological maturity. The age and structure varies with species and the site, characterized by multi-layers, uneven age, and uneven size, class structure, high degree of compositional and structural patchiness, and heterogeneity, and significant amounts of coarse woody habitat, woody debris, and tip-up mounds. You know, that's pretty subjective to try to look at that and say, yes, this is old growth, or no, it's not. In their 2004 master plan, they have said that in our national forest, trees over 150 years old, they have about 12,000 acres, so 0.8% of the Swinomic National Forest is currently old growth. But Lee Frelich has said this best: as far as I'm concerned, there's not and never will be a biological definition of old growth. Old growth is a human construct. It's what people say it is, and that varies among political jurisdictions. So state forests will define it differently. County forests will define it differently, if at all. Federal forest from the Superior National Forest is going to define it different than the Swinomic National Forest. When I lead hikes into old growth, on occasion people look at me and say, what good is it? Why should we let trees get old? Aren't they, mimicking that old statement of old trees are just going to waste? And so it's important to just very quickly run through some of the ecological processes of old growth. Why would we care to let trees die and fall down? Well, for one reason, these trees, when they fall down, provide nurse logs. They provide habitat for other trees to get established upon, because when an old growth hemlock tree falls down, it gets invaded by moss rather rapidly, surprisingly, and that it can take 200 years for a big old hemlock to fully decompose. In that 200 years, a whole lot of seedlings get started on top of that mossy, moist hemlock log. If you look at hemlock seeds, hopefully you've all seen a hemlock cone. It's about the size of a little root beer barrel. If you remember root beer barrels when you were a kid, they're just little things. They look way bigger in this picture, and the seeds are really tiny. And so eastern hemlock seeds, in one study, showed that 60% of the seeds were severely damaged after only 2 hours of drying. 80% died or did not recover after 6 hours of drying. I find that astonishing. So if we have any dry weather in the North Woods, which we do constantly, often anyway, and eastern hemlock seedlings have a hard time getting going. So, but on top of that moss retains moisture. Nurse logs are important. So we need to let trees die, fall over, have moss established upon them, and then they provide the nurseries. It's important to allow disease to happen, and it's important to allow trees to die and to have heart rot. This is a great den tree. We're looking at an old yellow birch here. Leopold in his Sand County Almanac had a chapter in November called A Mighty Fortress, where he talked about when he bought his woods, he bought almost as many tree diseases as he had trees, but it soon became clear to him that his woodlot was a mighty fortress, unequaled in the whole country. And he talks about all kinds of species that utilize dead and dying trees. And he ends with the prothonotary warbler who nests in an old woodpecker hole. And he says, the flash of his golden blue plumage amid the dank decay of the June woods is in itself proof the dead trees are transmuted into living animals, and vice versa. When you doubt the wisdom of this arrangement, take a look at the prothonotary. So these old trees provide dens for American martins. There's a white cedar tree with an American martin in it. Porcupines utilize them as dens, fishers as well. We have 30 species of cavity nesters in Wisconsin. Brown creepers actually nest underneath that sloughing off bark. I don't know if they nest in cavities so much, but they tuck their nest in behind the bark. Eastern kingbirds, I don't know that they utilize cavities, but they utilize broken off stubs. Common mergansers utilize cavities, but they'll also utilize trees that break off. There's a nest established in a broken off tree stump. Dead trees provide habitat. Here's an osprey pair mating, the cloacal kiss occurring for about 4 seconds. So they need dead trees because they like to nest at the top of the landscape and be able with those big wings to fly in and out without branches hindering them. Great blue herons, egrets, so forth, nest in colonies at the top of dead trees. Tip-up mounds are valuable as well. This creates a biological topography in our forest, a cradle knoll topography. And one of my favorite birds of all time, the winter wren, has such a beautiful little song, but it commonly nests anyway, in the root ball there. It tucks its nest into that muddy mass where all those roots are coming out, because that's a great place to hide from predators. The coarse woody debris on the forest floor provides nesting cover for a whole lot of ground nesting birds. One of the most beautiful birds, singing birds in the Northwoods, is the hermit thrush. Ovenbirds are less beautiful in their song, but quite common. Teachering away, nesting on the ground. There are some 32 or 33 species of birds in Wisconsin that nest on the ground. Some of these are grassland species, not all are nested in forest, but many of these do nest in forest on the ground, and they require coarse woody debris to be all over the ground in order to tuck their nests into them. This whole idea of German forestry, going into a woods and cleaning it out and making it easy to walk in, that's lovely for a walk, but a biological desert for birds. So I love this cartoon. Clean it up. It's supposed to be a rat hole. Doug Larson. Cleanliness is not next to godliness. We need random chaos, if you will, on a forest floor. And we need it along our lake shores, and we need it within our lake shore areas. Dead and dying trees provide habitat. So there's tremendous ecological value to letting trees grow old and to allowing them to die. And one of the things I talk about in the book is the difference between how we look at health of human beings and how we look at death within our human population. And we tend to extrapolate that and place it upon forests and not recognize the value and necessity of trees dying and allowing them to die, thinking that it's awful if we let that happen. It's not. It's not the equivalent at all of a human being dying. Study was done on some undeveloped and developed lakes in 1996 and 97 by the DNR. Mike Meyer, who's on the board, if I'm not mistaken, of Greenfire, was one of the authors. And so here's the constellation of species that you find in particular on developed lakes, which would have not old growth and all of the components of an old growth forest along the shoreline. Quite a few birds. And what they found was the total number of individuals was the same, but it was a different array of birds. So you'll see birds like robins and mourning doves and brown-headed cowbirds and chipping sparrows and so forth on the developed lakes. And on the undeveloped lakes, I apologize for the bit of blurriness in this, you'll find birds that are ground nesters or shrub nesters or high old growth tree nesters or cavity nesters, a very different constellation of birds. Same number of individuals, more or less. So if you're living on a developed lake, you'll still have birds, but you'll have a very different array. Study done on Camp Lake and Little Rock Lake near Minocqua, just north of Minocqua, was done to try to determine the value of letting trees die and to fall into our lake shores. And the DNR is all behind this now. We're no longer doing fish cribs, we're doing fish sticks, just recognizing the importance of having all of these branches down on our shorelines and into the water, because they provide habitat for small fish, for all kinds of aquatic insects, which of course are the prey base for all kinds of other birds and larger fish and so forth. Great study, don't have time to talk about it, but they took off the coarse woody habitat off of Little Rock Lake, and they added coarse woody habitat to Camp Lake using controlled measures on dividing up the lakes in half anyway, found that what they did was crash the yellow perch population, where they took away the coarse woody habitat. And by crashing the yellow perch, and they, as you can read here, they lay their eggs draped over weeds or submerged trees or shrubs. So by taking that away, the yellow perch weren't able to procreate. And the species that were preying upon them, in particular smallmouth and largemouth bass, were starving to death. Anyway, it caused a collapse of the fisheries. And where they added trees, they increased the fishery. It's a simple, fast way to say it. But when you increase the fishery, you're also increasing eagles and diving ducks and kingfishers, cormorants, herons, mergansers, etc. And all those tree branches falling into the water provide purchase for species like tree swallows and kingfishers, and taller ones for other fish-eating and or aquatic aerial catching species. So what are the values and overall of old growth? Well, for scientific benchmarks, certainly, how do we know it's quote, quote, normal if we don't allow the natural world to establish a baseline or a benchmark for us to compare what our work looks like to the natural world's? Values include ecological, plant, animal, community diversity, which we've already talked about. I wonder about old growth as a genetic repository. Are these in fact our fittest trees? They may just simply be our luckiest trees that were left alone. Nevertheless, there they are, and they may be the seed source that is most important for us to gather. And because they may represent, and I don't know this, I'd love to see a study on it, they may represent our most genetically fit trees. Old growth provides a whole host of ecosystem services, from retaining rainwater and preventing erosion, providing shade along lake shorelines, carbon sinks, so forth. And then there's the recreational, aesthetic, and spiritual value, the sense of going into these places and just literally being dropped to your knees by how beautiful they are. And that's worth a lot. We don't live by bread alone, right? We need beauty. And these sites provide that. We can also utilize them as big tree silvicultural sites. The Menominee Indians have been doing this for a long while and still maintaining a lot of very beautiful old growth habitat. So we can go in and cut and for saw timber and do it wisely and still maintain old growth communities. And the last value is simply the innate value of any life form on this planet. Whether you see it as God's creation or evolution's creation, one way or another, we should have profound reverence for any life and protect it for that reason alone. So where are the last best sites? The Porkies I already mentioned. Here's my wife holding on to a fabulous white pine that just blew down 2 years ago. Sad, really sad to lose that right along the Presque Isle River. Sylvania has 15,000 acres. Here's Mary holding up a yellow birch, giant yellow birch. Thank God she was there to hold it up. The Menominee Indian Reservation reputedly has the tallest white pine in the state, 165 feet tall, 51-inch DBH. And there's that famous photograph of looking down from space onto Menominee County and seeing that block of forest land surrounded by that patchwork quilt of farms and forest and settlement. So in the book, I list what I concluded and open to vast argument, the 50 best sites left in the state. So here's 10 sites. I gave a talk to a group that was paddlers as well. And so I listed this as the top 10 places to walk in woods, but also be able to paddle to. Our oldest trees, as I've mentioned before, are white cedar. So if you want to paddle along a site, paddle along Door County, along the Niagara Escarpment on the east side of Green Bay, and look up at all those cedars growing out of the Niagara Escarpment. That Niagara Escarpment runs for over 600 miles all the way to Niagara Falls, and again supports the most extensive old growth forest. Some of these white cedars in Door County have been aged, again by these couple Canadians. I don't know if anybody else in Wisconsin has ever rappelled down these cliff faces and tried to age some of these. But anyway, these guys from Canada found a 507-year-old white cedar, and they found a 616-year-old one as well. And there's very likely 1,000-year-old ones and older if some PhD students were just to take up the torch and risk life and limb to give us some answers on this. The biggest trees, pines anyway, that I can find are at the Cathedral Pine Stand north of Green Bay in the Lakewood area. It's 1,874 acre state natural area, but really only 22 acres where that red X is are old growth white pines. Archibald Lake's just right down there, and you can see there's a little road heading down to Archibald Lake, which I'll give you a picture of. It's worth walking. Here we are measuring the biggest white pines we found were 48-inch DBH and 154 foot tall. But here's some other fellows who walked in here in 2010, and they found a white pine that was 50 inches DBH, 154 feet tall. And they found another one that was slenderer, still 39 inches DBH, 154 feet tall. But what's interesting, I thought, was they mentioned that the same tree had been measured 11 years earlier, that narrower tree, thinner one, and it had grown 9.4 feet in 11 growing seasons, almost a foot a year, proving that old trees can still grow substantially. The tendency is to think that old forests are, that word, senescent, not growing anymore whatsoever. And that is true to a certain degree, but it's not true entirely. Some trees are still thriving, even though they're very old. Those trees have been aged, by the way. They've been cored in the Cathedral Pine. I think it was 2015. They were cored and 368 years old, so they're now 373, those that are still standing. Here's that little road going down to Archibald Lake with some big white pines along the way. There is a cultural heritage site in this area as well, some very large Native American mounds that can be found, worth looking for. The Apostle Islands has 1,300 acres of relic old growth left, in particular on lighthouse reservations that were set aside for the lighthouse keepers. The best site is on Outer Island, which I have never gotten to. Out of all the sites I wrote about in my book, this was the one I didn't get to because it's 21 miles out and I was too chicken to paddle my kayak out there. But it's 200 acres of truly remarkable old growth from what everyone tells me. Don Waller, a forest ecologist at the UW-Madison, has written about the Canada yew habitat and the lack of deer on these islands, and just saying that these unbrowsed vegetation communities, vegetative communities in the Apostles represent national and internationally important sites because they're a living baseline record for areas that don't have deer. So it's a priceless living laboratory for us to understand what the world would look like deerless. And if you've ever walked any of these sites, they're thick with Canada yew, and it's hard to even walk there because of the incredible prevalence. And if you don't believe that deer eat an awful lot of understory species, I'd love to show this photo of a deer exclosure at Dairyman's land in Boulder Junction, Vilas County. Pretty easy to guess which side the deer are living on. And I always recommend to anyone owning land to create a deer exclosure on their property. They might be astonished by what is growing if they could limit the access by deer and by snowshoe hares and cottontail rabbits. Franklin Butternut Lakes State Natural Area has some wonderful old growth along a state nature trail. It also happens to be a fabulous archaeological site with people occupying this area for over 8,000 years. So there's the reverence of the old trees, but it's also the reverence in this site of long established human occupation. Here's a 13-mile long Hidden Lakes Trail that goes all the way around Butternut Lake. It's a bunch of state natural areas in here, and that little circle up top is the Franklin Nature Trail. You can a little circular 1-mile loop that takes you through some beautiful old growth hemlock in particular. Plum Lake Hemlock Forest near the little village of Star Lake, 747 acre state natural area. Some wonderful old growth hemlocks, hardwoods in particular, and a whole series of trails that go around Star Lake that you can follow called Tramper Trails that walks you through some of this old growth. Here I am with our Australian Shepherd, a little mini Australian Shepherd who I think as a dog has seen more old growth than any other dog in the state. Just some blowdown here on the Plum Lake Trail. The Guido Rar Senior Tenderfoot Forest Reserve, owned by the Nature Conservancy, 996 acres. of which about 500 are old growth. You can see those two little trails within the site, the green and the orange trails. Those go through most of the old growth. Further west was cut. Access is only via boat, unless you want to tromp through the Ottawa National Forest and try to wend your way down in there. Just a fabulous site. Highly recommend it. What's interesting to me about it is it's bordered by Notre Dame University, which owns, gosh, what is it, 6,000 or 7,000 acres of land into the Ottawa and some into Wisconsin as well. Bordered to the south by the Dunn Lake State Naturary and by a conservation easement held by the Nature Conservancy with the Dunn family. And then further to the west is the Catherine Walter Wilderness Area owned by TNC as well, 2,000 acres, and the Ottawa National Forest then to the north. So this is part of a large area of contiguous forest. And along the shoreline of Tenderfoot Lake, you have this unharmed, I guess, pristine kind of setting where you have all this coarse woody habitat in the water the way it belongs. And a picture of a couple of TNC folks hugging a large yellow birch. Frog Lake and Pines is right across the road from where I live in Manitowish. I'm looking out my window right now over at it. Has some big white pines in it and red pines. The Manitowish River Wilderness Area, now redesignated as scenic something or other, is part of this area. And it's got some very lovely big white and red pines in it. Here we are snowshoeing back into the site a couple winters back. And this may be the last site I show you. Tucker Lake Hemlock State Natural Area. It's also a research natural area for the Schwalm and Nicolay. A lot of shoreline old growth. And there's a series of trails. The Round Lake Trail takes you back to Tucker Lake, or you can simply paddle back to a shorter way, paddle to point D on that map, and you can portage your boat back into Tucker Lake, which is a wilderness lake with 3 or 4 campsites on it, or you can just walk back then. Van Vliet Hemlocks in Vilas County, a great series of trails now developed, owned by the BCPL a while back and sold to the DNR and established then as a state natural area. And all the Friends group has built all these trails. This is a fabulous place to walk in to see old growth. And a couple last sites. I'm on the board of the Northwoods Land Trust. We just purchased the Sack Lake Hemlocks in central Iron County, which has some great old growth hemlock, yellow birch, sugar maple. And we're hoping to maybe purchase from the BCPL or trade lands with the BCPL. Some sites, they still have some old growth on. Here's one we visited northeast of this little town of Mercer. Last but not least, what's the vision for the future? This is a shot on the dark on my part. I tried to read the literature and determine, given the nature of natural disturbance, how big a site you have to you'll never guarantee that it's big enough given some of the huge blowdowns we've had, but given the average size of blowdowns, what makes sense, and fires, what makes sense to have as a minimal size to protect against natural disturbance. And what I kept seeing was about 40,000 acres minimum. So I recommend in the book that we ought to have in our state 3 core sites that are 40,000 acres in order to withstand the major windstorms and to provide ecosystem functions. If it's a smaller site, as all these sites are that I listed in the book, they're easily impacted by deer and by brown-headed cowbirds and garlic mustard, all kinds of things can easily access them because they're small. My preference was to actually look at a couple sites that might be 100,000 acres. Why not think big? It sounds huge, but it's really only 13 miles by 13 miles on a side, a distance that you can walk in a day. I thought, wouldn't that be something to have a place in Wisconsin that you could get up in the morning, walk all day, and a good day's walk is 13 miles, and at the end of the day, you just were you've been in old growth the whole time. Wouldn't that be magnificent for us to have? So I proposed that in the book and don't have a clue if anybody is paying an ounce of attention, but I threw it out there for someone to potentially look at. Of hope also is the Schwalm and Nicolay master plan. They are allocating 19% of their forest land to developing old growth areas and to anything that has some current old growth. So that's exciting. I don't know that how much of that's contiguous. I don't know. There are 307 stands that they're looking at in their research natural areas divided among 183,000 areas. So they tend not to be that large. I'll end with this quote from Rick Bass. He says, "To stand amid the last uncut old growth groves of giant cedar, white pine, hemlock is to be reminded that we are still capable of experiencing the greatest depths of peace and humility. Love these endangered places with all your heart while they're still here. A great society's legacy should be the wild places it protects, not the ones it removes. Love them not less, but harder and more passionately." So that's the cover of my book. There I am, lost as usual, looking at a map. And I'm ending there. If anyone's still awake or still on the other end, I'm happy to answer or try to answer any questions.
John, I guarantee we're still awake. Thank you.
I went a little too long. I apologize.
And we have a few questions for you here. The first one,
Okay.
if we could have you go back in your presentation, one person would really like to see the slide that you had that showed the tree species pre-settlement. It was an early graph, a bar graph, if I recall.
A bar graph of David Mladenov's early on? Is that what they're looking for?
I believe so.
Okay, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to escape out of this and do it this way.
And John, while you're looking for that, we'll just remind all the folks who are with us that if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and submit them, and we'll get to as many as we can.
So is that the bar graph the person was looking for?
That would look like it to me.
Okay.
Yes, the person.
And what was the,
And I don't have a further question that goes with that, so we can
Okay.
just leave that up on the screen for a minute.
Sure.
Comment that came in, great presentation, and I agree, it was just spellbound. I also, before I forget, I want to remind everyone that this recording will be on our website, and if you have trouble finding it, you can always just go in the search function and search forestry, search old growth, you know, put in those kind of key words, and you'll find this, and it should be up by tomorrow or Saturday. We should have it on our website. So here's a question, John. First of all, thank you. And the question is there a specific site, Catherine Walter, Frog Lake, and Pines, etc., that would be a good existing starting point for the 13-mile length of old growth vision that you have in mind?
Yeah, and so actually in the book, I have drawn some very general maps of 4 different areas that I thought we could focus on. One of those areas is in that Plum Lake, Star Lake area of the Northern Highlands American Legion State Forest. There's a series of state natural areas there that could be connected if some enterprising series of foresters wanted to create a big vision. I'm just sneaking back into my book here to try to recall what else I had to say, where the other sites were. One site's over in the Chequamegon National Forest over by Drummond. There's a series of state natural areas over there as well that would make sense in Bayfield County, southern Bayfield County. There's a site in Vilas County over by the Franklin Butternut state natural area. Again, there's a whole series of state natural areas already established there, plus 2 wilderness areas that could conceivably be connected. Again, if we had a big enough vision and the desire to do so. And then I listed a further one over into Forest County that could also be considered. Just some very general thoughts for the professional foresters, for the Fred Clarks of the world who are way smarter than me about such things, to sit down and what could be tied together. And certainly there'd be a whole bunch of young forest within that, but that could over time grow into old growth. But what do we have in old growth that's close already or close to being old growth that we could designate as our 40,000 acre minimum site so that someone 100 years from now could walk. Well, 100,000 acres would need to be for that 13 miles. Those are just some thoughts. There's maybe better sites. Again, there's better people with maps and better foresters out there than I'll ever be that might have some other ideas.
Thank you, John. A different type of question. Can you share the most poignant or memorable personal experience you've had in old growth?
Gosh. That's stumping me for the moment.
Well, we won't put you on the spot. We'll move on, and you can keep that in the back of your mind if something comes up.
All right.
Here's a more direct question. What's the most extensive old growth forest in the US?
Gee. Well, the Adirondacks, for the eastern part of the country, the Adirondacks in New York are always thought of as having the most extensive old growth. Out west, I honestly don't know. Perhaps somebody else on this program may have that idea, may have that. But I don't know out west.
Okay.
But the Adirondacks have, it's a, gosh, what is it, 1 million or 2 million acre park, quote, quote. And a lot of that is still in primary or old growth forest status. A lot of it's very high up, so it's not big woods. It's smaller forest, but they're uncut primary forests.
And John, who published your book, Our Living Ancestors?
I did. I had originally, I was going to publish it. I had a contract with the University of Wisconsin Press, and we just couldn't agree on a final contract, so we had to dissolve our relationship. But the good news of that was, before that happened, Eric Epstein was one of the readers of the book via the UW Press, and he helped immensely to make sure I was on the straight and narrow on all kinds of information. So after what I found is publishing is difficult, and I should shut up about it. No one wants to hear the woes of a writer, but regional books are hard to publish. They don't make a whole lot of money. They don't sell a whole lot. So not many publishers want to deal with them. So anyway, I just decided to do it myself through our massive press, which is my office only, which is 8 by 12. It's called Matatoes River Press. So we've published 9 books over the last 25 years. And it's easier to sometimes just to publish it yourself than to go through all the motions of trying to get somebody to believe in it and as a regional book, and to think that it will sell enough, because it all comes down to economics when all is said and done.
Well, thanks for that, John. We're really glad you did publish it.
Thanks.
Here's another one. Many northern tree species, such as hemlock, sugar maple, yellow birch, are projected to decline due to climate change. What are your thoughts on helping these sites adapt to climate change, or even planting trees from southern Wisconsin into these sites?
That is just a fabulous question. And I don't know. I was on the board of the Nature Conservancy when we purchased the Tenderfoot site, and I've worked with lots of folks on lots of sites in old growth. And one of the great fears is for the Nature Conservancy, for instance, was here we put all this time and money into purchasing these sites, and now we're trying to manage these sites. And if climate change goes the way that it could in worst case scenarios, we're projected to be an oak savanna up here. So what was the point in protecting it in that case? There are people studying this. Linda Parker over in the Schwalm-Nicolay National Forest has given a lot of her time, as I understand it anyway, to trying to look at what is it that we should be doing in planting and or managing forests for a drier and warmer summers and winters. Maybe Fred's got some ideas as well. I'm not well tuned, to be honest. I would defer to somebody else who understands that topic better than I, if anyone would like to chime in.
Well, I'll just say, John, it is a really important discussion, and there's some especially vulnerable areas such as our black ash swamps now, where the future for those is I think a source of real interest in terms of what replaces them. So I think there's a lot of good minds on that question.
Yeah, I agree.
So John, even though we are a bunch of scientists, or many are, I'm going to ask you to put up a photo. So we'll stop looking at the graph, and if you could show us one of your beautiful photos, we'll have that on our screens while we continue.
Let's see. Whoa. All this history. Let's get through all that. Where's a good photo? Are you ill yet? Let's see.
Doing great.
Ooh. Earthworm damage. Yikes. Let's go to a better one than that.
That's perfect.
Ah, that one. How's that one?
Thank you. So we have some more questions and comments about your book, John. Another question is, where can it be purchased?
Darn hard to find. There are some bookstores up north here who do have it. Frankly, the easiest way is to simply go to my website and order it. And I'm not trying to go to your local bookstore first and have them order it so you're supporting your local bookstore. But if for any reason they can't get it, they would just have to contact me. Manitowish River Press. Our website is manitowish.com, and you can order it directly online that way, or just give me a phone call. A fellow from New Mexico called me today, an old growth forester out there, and he'd heard of the book and he ordered the book. So yeah, phones work still, email works, but manitowish.com is the website. I can give you my email too if people want that.
In fact, we'll put that out in the follow-up email to everyone, your contact information.
I don't sell through Amazon. Amazon and I have had a breakup, or we're no longer connected.
Okay. Just want to pass along a comment from another person on the webinar today. The person says, I've already read the book prior to purchasing it. I had to have a copy. It was such a good read and also a reference tool.
That's great. I worked really hard on trying to make it a book that was a story, that was a narrative, that so the science would go down easy. And I hope I accomplished it. I worked hard to try to do that.
As we all know, stories are the way to draw people in. So we appreciate that.
Yeah.
Here's just an idea to consider, just for your comment. Someone's suggesting, how about a 4 mile by 4 mile block with a serpentine trail from which you could not see or hear another person who's on a different segment. That could easily be more than a 13-mile trail, and it could return you to your starting point. And you'd have the option of having a shorter route as well.
I'm all in, as long as that's an ecologically large enough area to have a core area that isn't being impacted dramatically anyway by all of our invasive species. So I'm trying to convert 4 by 4 into total acres. Fred could probably do that faster than me, but yeah, that would be the only concern, but that's a great idea. Yeah, have it be a loop trail. Come back where you started.
Yeah, very cool idea.
Yeah, I like that.
Just kind of playing off that with the issues of management, have you seen some good examples where forest management's been used to create old forest characteristics?
You know, the Board of Commissioners of Public Lands does a very good job overall of working in older forests and maintaining the quality of those older forests while still taking off timber. So for instance, the Van Vliet hemlock area that I showed a slide of, and the trails within that, they had cut in there 3 different times. And if you go in there, there's several places that clearly have been cut, but there's other places where they were so selective in what they did that boy, most people wouldn't even know that they'd been in there. So I think BCPL does a very good job overall of managing for old growth characteristics. They're very aware of it. And that's the big deal is how aware are you and how much do you value it? There's so much pressure to produce economic gain, short-term gain. Gosh, it is, forester, I feel sorry for all foresters. They're being hammered from all sides by industry and by consumers, and then by ecologists and other folks who want to maintain more old growth. And it's a difficult situation, but yes, you can manage to create old growth characteristics. I have a little piece in the back of the book, 2 or 3 pages to give people an idea if they own property of what they could do to enhance old growth more rapidly, potentially, than what the natural old might do. My problem with saying that is I worry that we are always looking at enhancing bigger trees in a faster way, but does that, I mean, what do we really know about what's taking place with mycorrhizal fungi or taking place in the forest litter layer with insects? You know, we know so little that I worry that while we might enhance quicker growth of bigger trees, that we may be in that process harming other species that we simply aren't aware of.
Well, thank you for that, John. And one last question before we wrap up tonight.
Sure.
Have you written any poetry on old growth?
I have, yes. I have a poetry book out called Cold to the Bone, and it's got quite a few poems in there that relate to old growth. And I'm working on a poetry book now that, Lord knows if it'll ever be finished and if anyone will ever publish it, but I'm basing it on Wendell Berry poems. So hopefully everyone's familiar with Wendell Berry, and he has an absolutely exceptional book of poems called This Day. It's 300, 400 pages of poems called Collected in New Sabbath Poems. He went out every Sunday morning for, the last like 40 years, and he would come back and write a poem. That was his kind of church going. And so these are his Sabbath poems, of which many talk about talk a lot about farming, a lot about agriculture, a lot about angry poems about how we're harming the planet, but also some poems that include things about pristine places. So I've been anyway playing off different lines and or verses within his poems and writing poems using that as the genesis, the idea. So I've already contacted Wendell's publisher, and they've given me permission to utilize a line or two for every one of these poems. So that'll be a cool book, I think, if I ever finish it. But yes, there's some poetry about it. Cold to the Bone is the name of the poetry book, available through my website if you're foolish enough to want to buy it.
Thank you, John. And we'll look forward to the book taking off on Wendell Berry's poems too. So now you're committed.
I'm looking forward to it too. I hope it happens. I've got like 20 of them done, so I need another 30 at least.
Yeah, absolutely. And John, thank you so much. And that piece of closing inspiration is just perfect.
Thanks for allowing me to take time with everyone. I really appreciate it.
Well, I think we can say with confidence that everyone really enjoyed that discussion, and you've generated a lot of thinking today. And for those of us on the call, the Greenfire's work in forests and forest ecosystem is directly related to what you're talking about. We play an active role working with the DNR, with Board of Commissioners of Public Lands, and with many of our county forest organizations to make sure that protecting all the elements of these ecosystems is front and center in our overall forests in the state. And that's as important as any other piece of work that we do. So on behalf of everyone at Greenfire, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your experience with us and inspiring us to continue to do better. And on behalf of everyone who participated, thank you for joining us. It's been a wonderful evening. Many of you are ready to go right outside and put your seeds in the ground, so we're not going to hold you any longer. But we just want to say thanks on behalf of Wisconsin's Green Fire. We hope you'll take time to give us some feedback when you get a survey in the mail, in the email that is, tomorrow morning. And also we want to remind you that our next webinar program will be on May 21st, and it will be on the topic of creating a 21st century energy system in Wisconsin. So look for more details about that in the very near future. So on behalf of all of us, have a wonderful evening. Thanks for your time, and we will see you together out in the field again very soon. Take care.
Thanks, Fred.